We sat in that clearing for a while after that, taking stock of what had happened. The shock of suddenly arriving in this foreign place, and just as suddenly losing our guide in such a brutal manner, was difficult to bear, especially for Fluttershy, who was still sitting there crying uncontrollably. Rainbow Dash had scavenged the cloaks from the dead guardsmen, and after Rarity used her magic to repair the holes and clean out some of the blood, had draped one of them across both herself and Fluttershy in an attempt to comfort her. Fluttershy had responded by flinging herself into Rainbow's arms and gripping her tightly. The two of them sat there, Rainbow Dash looking slightly uncomfortable, but willing to put up with our friend's distress. Rarity, Applejack, Spike, and Pinkie Pie were sitting in a circle. Pinkie was inspecting her new gun, and Applejack had retrieved the rest of the weapons of the guardsmen. They too were draped in the remaining cloaks, Rarity having cut one into portions and fashioned a smaller one for Spike, and appeared to be deep in discussion about something. I was kneeling next to the body of Trixie. She was lying in the dirt, a bullet wound in her forehead, silent and staring. I reached over and closed her sightless blue eyes, brushing her blue and white striped hair away from her still face. "I'm sorry," I murmured, grief welling up in me. "I wasn't able to keep you safe." I leaned back slightly, and my hand brushed her staff, which was lying on the ground, crystal shattered and scattered around. I picked up her staff, inspecting it. It was a long piece of what appeared to be polished oak, graceful designs carved into the entirety. The only exception was where Trixie had gripped it, which was worn smooth with years of use. The crystal appeared to have been firmly attached with strands of wire. Looking down at her still form, I made a decision. Taking my crystal, I fiddled with the wires until I was able to attach my own crystal to the end of the staff. Gripping where Trixie had, I tested the feel of it. I felt the magic flow through me, and the staff began to glow with a bright purple light. Startled, the others looked over at me. "Twilight, whatever are you doing, darling?" asked Rarity. I ignored her, gazing down at Trixie. "Thanks," I said, bowing slightly to her. I looked over at Rarity. "Rarity, do you think you could repair Trixie's cloak? I'd like to have it, at least until we can get some new clothing." Rarity looked at me with understanding in her eyes. "Of course, dear. Give me just a minute." She stood and moved over to where I was kneeling. Using her own crystal, she was able to remove Trixie's cloak and inspected it. Concentrating, she repaired the two holes in the shoulder and center and cleared away the blood stains. She then handed it down to me, and I fastened it around my neck before standing, staff in hand. The others all watched me expectantly. I looked around at them, then drew up my courage and spoke. "Everyone, we have a job to do. We need to find the elements of harmony and eliminate discord once and for all. If not just for us, then for Trixie and all that she has lost. I say we press on to the hideout," she mentioned, "and see what we can find out about the elements in this world." Rainbow Dash spoke up first. "I'm with you at that one. We owe Discord a good smackdown for what he's done. Let's do this." Applejack nodded as well. "I think we're all in agreement with that. Besides," she continued in a more anxious voice, "I want to see Big Mac again." I was startled at that, until I remembered that before being attacked, Trixie had mentioned something about Big Mac being at the Resistance hideout. I nodded. "Of course," I replied. Looking down at Fluttershy, whose eyes were red from crying, I reached out my hand, a sympathetic expression on my face. She smiled up at me and took my hand, letting go of Rainbow Dash. I noticed as she stood that her neck was red and raw from where Discord had grabbed her earlier, and wondered not for the first time if she was going to survive in this new world. She was also starting to shiver from the cool night air, which reminded us all of her current clothing situation. After we all got to our feet, I paused a moment, then concentrating, used my magic to lift Trixie's body into the air behind us. The others watched in silence, understanding on their faces as she floated along with us. We moved quickly through the remains of the forest, heading into the ruined buildings Trixie had identified as the remains of the town of Equus. As we entered the town, I was struck by the similarities to our hometown of Ponyville. The streets were set up in a similar fashion, even including some of the same stores in the same locations as back home. We even passed what appeared to be a copy of Rarity's dress shop, and the road that back home would have led out of town to Sweet Apple Acres was in the same location. The others noticed this as well, and even commented on it. "Hey, that's where Sugar Cube Corner is," cried Pinkie Pie, a smile on her face as we approached the festively decorated building. The smile froze and began to crack slightly as we got close to see that the door was hanging off its hinges and all of the windows were broken or missing. What could have been the store's sign was swinging in the chill air, hanging from one loop. She gazed sadly at the place of so much happiness where she had grown so much over the years. Rainbow Dash, who had been watching around us, pointed into the distance. "Hey, that looks like the library." We all turned and looked in the direction she was pointing, noting a large tree that overshadowed the buildings around it. Feeling suddenly homesick, I began to rush towards it, Trixie's floating body being carried behind me by my magic. The others followed quickly, and we all rounded a corner at the same time to see what I thought would be my old home. It wasn't what I thought it would be. Instead of being a large tree filled with inviting windows and a doorway, the tree was merely a tree. However, it stood next to a large building that appeared as run-down as the rest of town, but still held an air of familiarity to it. There was also a feeling that the building's appearance wasn't what it seemed, and as we approached, I noticed that more of the windows appeared to be intact than in other buildings we had encountered in the town, and the door appeared to be solidly hung and in remarkable condition. We walked up the door with some trepidation, all of us pulling our cloaks closer around us in some fashion, with the exception of Rainbow Dash, who had left the cloak to Fluttershy. As we approached, I floated Trixie's body towards me and took it into my arms. It didn't feel right just having her floating around like that as we went inside. Her weight settled on me as Applejack reached the door and pulled it open. We all moved into the library and looked around. The darkened room looked much like the rest of town. Shelves falling apart, moldy books strewn about the area. Some destroyed furniture was lying about as well, chairs and couches interspersed among the shelving. It looked as if when it was a fully functioning library, it would have been a very inviting place. As we inspected the area, I heard a small sound behind me. Turning around, I moved into the corner of the room, still carrying Trixie's body, and started inspecting the area. "Twilight?" called Applejack. "What are you doing?" I thought I heard something. As I approached the area where I heard the sound, I noticed that one of the shelves that had been on the wall appeared to have moved slightly. It looked like there was a drag trail in the dust on the floor. I kneeled down slightly, inspecting the floor, and suddenly heard a click behind me and felt the pressure of hard metal on the back of my head. I froze and heard a familiar deep voice behind me. "Who are you? And what the hell are you doing here?" As I knelt there, unsure of what to do next, I heard Applejack's voice call out, "Big Mac, that's Twilight, let her up!" The pressure let up from my head, and I slowly stood and turned around to look at whoever was standing behind me. I found myself looking up at a large man with orange hair, dressed in a work shirt and overalls, holding a large handgun that was now pointed at the ceiling. He was looking down at me in shocked surprise, turning his head this way and that, taking in me, Trixie's body and the rest of us in sequence. His eyes alighted on Applejack, and he dropped the gun, rushing over and folding her into a bear hug, lifting her off the floor. "AJ?" he said, tears forming in his eyes. "Is that really you? I thought you were dead." Applejack gasped from the force of his hug, and when he finally put her down, she shook her head. As much as I'd like to say I am, I'm not. When he looked confused, she continued, I'm not the AJ you know, Big Mac. Trixie brought us here from another world. He continued to look confused, until he looked closer at whom I was carrying. Shock covered his face as he registered who the body was, followed by sadness. Trixie, he said forlornly. He shook his head sadly, then looked around at us once more. He appeared to be thinking about something, and nodded as if making a decision. He beckoned to us all and led us to the shelf that I had been inspecting a minute ago. Grabbing the shelf with one hand, he pulled it back on hidden hinges, opening a passageway which led down into the ground. This way, he said curtly, and started down the stairs there. We followed, not knowing what else to do, and Rainbow Dash pulled it shut behind her with ease. Big Mac paused for a moment, surprise flitting across his face, but continued down the stairway, which opened up into a large underground chamber with multiple doorways. As Big Mac entered the room, a woman who had been standing over a table in the center of the room looked up. She had a light purple sweater on, which coordinated with her purple striped hair, and jeans along with the thick leather boots. Mac, dear, what happened? Who did you... She trailed off as the rest of us filed into the room, naked except for our cloaks, looking exhausted and bedraggled. Her hands flew up to her mouth, and she gasped, Oh my God, but you're dead, you're all dead. Big Mac nodded and gestured to me and my burden. Trixie, was all he said. The woman looked down at Trixie's body, shocked and saddened. So she was successful. She must have been so proud of herself at the end. What happened to her? I told her everything that happened, starting with her showing up in our world and the incident with Discord. Big Mac had moved to stand next to her, his arms around her shoulders as they listened to our tale. Their expressions grew more and more serious as I spoke, and when I finished, they looked at each other knowingly. The woman spoke first, shaking her head. She had grown so much during the last few years, and with the war against Discord and his forces, she was such an experienced battle mage and was always on the alert. Discord was never able to find her, no matter how much she searched. I guess that she was so elated that she was able to bring you back to us that she let her guard down just long enough. Discord did say he had been looking for her a long time, I replied. I'm sorry, you are? Oh, I apologize, she replied. I understand that you might not recognize me. I'm Cheerilee, Mac's wife. Cheerilee? Replied Rarity. Then she giggled slightly. I remember when my sister and her friends tried to get the two of you together with a love potion. It looks like it might have worked here. Cheerilee giggled as well. Yes, I remember that as well. Oddly enough, it was just that afternoon after the potion wore off that we were able to spend enough time to realize just how much we did care about each other. We got married a few months later. You made my lovely dress, and Applejack was my maid of honor. Mac gave her a hug, looking down at her lovingly. She looked back, smiling, then turned back to us, serious once more. Now, since you are here, I'm assuming Trixie told you where we were located? I nodded. It was one of the last things she told us before Discord arrived. I don't think he heard her, but I could be wrong. She and Meg looked at each other, and they both nodded. Meg let go of her and moved off through one of the doorways. Cheerilee watched him go. He's going to warn the others. We may have to move quickly if Discord does know where we are. I nodded, then felt myself get weak from the strain of carrying Trixie's body. Swaying slightly, I asked, Is there some place I can lay her? Cheerilee started, then replied, Oh, of course. I'm so sorry. Please bring her over here. She gestured to a small table against the wall in the back. I moved over to where she indicated and gently laid Trixie's body down on the wood. Standing up, I rested on my newly acquired staff, a feeling of exhaustion coming over me. I saw from the expression on my friends' faces that I wasn't the only one feeling like we'd been through an ordeal. Cheerily took in our appearances and moved over to one of the other openings. "Come with me, please," she said. "We need to get you some clothing before you all freeze." As we followed her along a small passageway, she continued speaking. "I am so sorry that I didn't think of this sooner. I'm still reeling from what's happened. We've both lost and gained a great asset today, and I'm not the only one who's having a hard time with it." Applejack, who had been signing since meeting Big Mac, murmured just loud enough for me to hear, "That's true." I glanced behind me and noticed the expression on her face. It was a combination of fear, frustration, and confusion. I understood immediately what was going on. Meeting another Big Mac and having to dash his hopes so quickly must have been hard on her. At the same time, he was her brother, and she wanted to make him happy, even if it was the Big Mac she knew. We continued in silence for a short distance, until we entered a large room. There were a few wardrobes against the wall, some sewing supplies on the other, a bed against the back, and a workstation. Rarity immediately hurried over to the wardrobes, opening them, and began inspecting the clothing inside. Glancing over at the sewing supplies, her eyes grew wide. "Why, I recognize those supplies. They look just like mine. That's my sewing machine. I even see the nick in it where it was dropped a while back." She really looked over at her, taken aback. "That makes sense in an odd way. This was our Rarity's room, until she died a year ago. We've kept it as it was for the most part, since we still need to repair clothing, though none of us are as good as you ever were." Rarity let out a squeal of delight. She immediately fell back into her old personality, grabbing clothing from the wardrobes, and one by one pulled us all further into the room. Cheerily smiled warmly and backed out of the room. "I just wait for you to finish getting ready. Come back to our meeting room when you're done." I nodded and barely had time to offer her thanks before Rarity grabbed me and pulled me closer to her, tape measure at the ready. "Now, I'm not as familiar with our measurements here as I'm at home, and these," she gestured to my breasts, "are going to take some getting used to, especially Applejack's and Fluttershy's." She looked pointedly over at Fluttershy, who covered her ample chest modestly with her cloak, blushing. "So if you could all be so kind as to be patient while I take everyone's measurement, I should be able to find some outfits for us without any trouble. However, first things first. Twilight, I can tell you're comfortable with your staff, but I would rather have something a little more fashionable." She began poking around in the sewing materials for a moment before exclaiming, "Aha!" She pulled out a length of silver chain, and holding her crystal, focused on it, a look of concentration on her face. As her crystal glowed, the chain wrapped itself around in a secure crisscross pattern as she deftly moved her fingers away from the chain, always keeping a hand on the crystal. Soon enough, the chain sealed itself together, and she was fastening the clasp of her new necklace behind her neck. "That's better," she nodded, satisfied. Turning to the rest of us, she began appraising us up. "All right, let's get started. Rainbow Dash, come here, please." With that, the next hour passed in a blur of clothing, magic, and flying sewing supplies. Finally, everyone was dressed in a well-fitting simple clothing, even Spike, who Rarity had to trim down a few items from the wardrobes in order to fit him. I admired Rarity's control of her magic using her crystal necklace, but still felt that Trixie's staff was more my style. I've often thought lately, if I had chosen to wear my crystal like Rarity, I would have been able to save at least one of my friends. But I have to crush those thoughts before they get the best of me. Otherwise, I'd go crazy. Feeling refreshed and more presentable, we all trooped back into the meeting room to see Cheerilee together with Big Mac once more, both bending over the same table we had seen her at when we arrived. "We're done," I announced as they both looked up at the sound of us entering the room. Big Mac's eyes travelled over us to rest on Applejack, who had retained most of her weapons we had taken from Discord's men, where they paused for a moment. As she noticed him looking at her, he glanced away hurriedly, but not before I noticed the tears forming in his eyes as he took in his sister's appearance. Feeling a pang of guilt for bringing his dead sister seemingly back to life, I attempted to sway his attention by focusing on the task at hand. "Is everyone prepared to move if need be?" I asked. He nodded, still looking away from us, but appeared to master his emotions enough to speak, albeit in a more clipped tone than what I was used to. "They're always ready to move." Cheerily nodded in agreement. "We've got possibly safe houses all over the area. We just need the incentive to move from one to the other." I nodded in return. "Now, I have to ask you, do you have any information on where I can find the elements of harmony?" Cheerily smiled. "Straight to the point, aren't you? As a matter of fact, the location of the elements is well known. Discord has made no secret of their whereabouts, almost as if he was taunting us." Rainbow Dash scowled. "That sounds like him, the punk. He'd want to make it seem like you can take them at any time, then pull the rug out from under you at the last minute." "Exactly," replied Cheerily. "As such, we have this map of the land, each element marked out in case we felt up to such a feat." She gestured to the map on the table, which appeared to have colored pins sticking out of it. I looked closer and gasped as the familiar shape of our land appeared before me. "I know these places," I exclaimed. "Really? That makes this easier then," replied Cheerily. She pointed out the different locations, providing some warning about each. "The closest is in the endless forest here. I believe it's the element of loyalty, and it's guarded by Discord's magical timberwolves and their pack leader." Fluttershy jumped and stammered, "Timberwolves?" Applejack scoffed and twirled one of the hunting knives she had acquired. "We'll take 'em down into Kindling. No problem. What next?" Cheerily pointed towards the second closest pin, which was located in a city to the south. "Here's where we believe the element of generosity is located. This is also the home base for the changelings and their queen. We've had a hard time making headway against them due to their changeling powers." I groaned at the mention of the changelings, but the thought of them sparked another. "Cheerily, what's happened to my brother?" Cheerily flinched slightly as she was in the process of indicating the next location, and I saw Big Mac tense. Without looking up, she replied, "We haven't seen him since Cadence vanished and you died. I'm not exactly sure where he is right now." Before I could inquire further, she continued, pointing out the locations of the elements. "I believe there are two elements here, the elements of laughter and kindness." She indicated a location in the snowy north. The Crystal Empire ruled with an iron fist by King Sombra and his Queen of Shadows. "That meanie?" Pinkie Pie snarled. "Wasn't he banished to the shadows or something?" Cheerily shook her head. When Discord was released, he brought him back as well. They've worked together in cementing their grip on the lands over the years and are often in consultation with one another. "Who's the Queen of Shadows?" asked Rarity. "I can't say I ever heard of her." "That would be the former Princess Lunar, of course," replied Cheerily matter-of-factly. We all gasped, and she looked up, surprised at our reactions. "Didn't you banish Nightmare Moon in your world?" I shook my head. "No, we freed Luna from her Nightmare Moon personality. She's much happier now." It was Cheerily's turn to be surprised. "Well, I wish that had happened here. She was banished once more after you were unable to convert her. Discord released her at the same time as King Sombra, and established them as King and Queen of the Crystal Empire." I looked around at my friends who were looking grim. Even Pinkie Pie was having a hard time keeping a smile on her face at the news we were receiving. Before Cheerilee could elaborate onto the next element, we were suddenly interrupted by the sounds of running feet, and suddenly 2 young voices exclaimed as one, "Pinkie Pie!" We turned to look at the doorway that Big Mac had entered earlier to see 2 small children, not much older than 5, running into the main room. The 2 were obviously twins, though the girl had orange hair and the boy had brown. Pinkie's eyes lit up at the sight of the 2, who promptly tackled her, knocking her to the ground in a fit of giggling. The boy who was hugging her in the leg spoke up, saying, "Pinkie, we missed you. They said you gone away and we wouldn't able to see you again. Can we play? Huh? Can we?" Pinkie was looking so much like her regular self that I had a hard time telling them no. As I hesitated, Cheerilee spoke up first, sounding like the teacher she truly was. Now, Pumpkin Pound, Pinkie needs to be able to breathe." At this, the 2 immediately jumped off Pinkie Pie and looked suitably abashed, though they were both fighting hard not to break into grins. Cheerilee smiled at them. "I need you, Pinkie Pie, for just a little longer, okay? Then you can play." They both looked disappointed. "Okay, Miss Cheerilee," they chorused. After one more tackling hug, they left Pinkie Pie giggling on the floor and ran back into the room they had left. Cheerilee watched them go, a sad smile on her face. I wished their parents were still around to see them grow into such wonderful children. "What happened to the cakes?" asked Pinkie, who was being helped up by Spike. "Died," Big Mac replied gruffly, "a year ago." "They were running a food shelter that got raided by Discord's men," explained Cheerilee, looking somber. "There were no survivors. We've all been raising the kids as best we can, given the circumstances." Pinkie slammed her fist down onto the table. "In that case, I need to go do my duty," she exclaimed. "I need to go make those kids smile." As she rushed off, leaving us all in her wake, I just watched her go. Cheerilee made as if to stop her, but then shook her head. Those kids could do with some time with her. They were so disappointed when we told them Pinkie was gone, kept asking about when she was coming back. Tears started to form in her eyes, and she brushed them away, turning back to the rest of us. Now, where were we? Scanning the map, she nodded to herself and pointed out one of the other pins. "Here's the location of the element of honesty. I'm not sure who is guarding it, but it will be difficult to get to." She made as if to move to the next pin, but I stopped her. She appeared anxious, but I ignored it and focused on the last location she had indicated. "That's Canterlot," I exclaimed, looking up at her for confirmation. She shook her head. "Camelot is what we've called it. But yes, it's the capital city. Now something of a wasteland. Now the final location is—" Hang on, interrupted Rainbow Dash. "You haven't told us who's guarding the elements yet." "That's because I don't know for certain," she replied, getting more anxious. "I can't help you with this one." There was a silence for a minute as Rainbow Dash eyed her, then finally dropped her gaze with a huff. "Fine. What's the last one?" Cheerilee immediately pointed to a mountain on the outskirts of the map, to the east of Camelot. "Here," she said. "The Dragon King is guarding this one as a favor to Discord. The element of magic." As we stared down at the map, a thud occurred behind us. Rainbow Dash sighed and reached down to pick up Fluttershy, who had fainted. "Come on, Fluttershy. We've faced a dragon before and lived to tell the tale. You can do this again." Cowering in Rainbow's arms, Fluttershy shook her head emphatically. "Not another dragon. I can't handle those things anymore." Spike reached over and tapped her on the shoulder. Fluttershy, I'm a dragon and you faced me when I was out of control." "But you're different, Spike," she wailed. "I know you." Applejack put a hand on her shoulder. "We'll all be there with you, girl. You won't have to do it alone. Besides, It will be a while before we get to that one, so you'll have plenty of time to get over your fears." Fluttershy let out a sob and continued to cling to Rainbow Dash, who just rolled her eyes. I made as if to comfort her, but Rainbow stopped me. "Let her cry it out. I'll take care of it. Don't worry." She looked over at Cheerilee. "Is there something we can go and rest? I'm beat and Fluttershy will need somewhere quiet to pull herself together." Cheerilee nodded and pointed down the new entryway. "We have some sleeping quarters down there. We currently have a few empty beds, so you won't be kicking anyone out tonight. Second room on the right should be empty, and it'll have a couple of beds in it. Rainbow Dash nodded her thanks and guided Fluttershy down the corridor. I looked around at my remaining friends, and we all nodded. "I think we're going to turn in as well, though I do have a few things I need to discuss with you before going to sleep." Cheerilee nodded, then directed Big Mac to guide the others to their sleeping arrangements. After they had all left the rooms, she turned to me expectantly. "First of all, I'm going to need a copy of this map with the element's location marked. Second, we're going to need some weapons and maybe some training in how to use them, though." As a thought occurred to me, Pinkie Pie seems oddly proficient in these guns. Cheerilee seemed to expect this. Yes, she always had a knack for them. She was quite deadly when she had the opportunity. "I'll see what I can put together for you. The weapons you took from Discord's men should give you a nice place to start, and I'm guessing your magic will help you greatly." I nodded. "That is true, but I think I'll feel better if I have something to fall back on. I'm still not used to using magic in this world. The idea of using this," I hefted the staff, "instead of this," I pointed at my forehead, "still seems unnatural." Cheerilee smiled sadly. "Oh, Twilight, it was you who once told me that magic didn't just come from here." She tapped my crystal. "But from here." She tapped my forehead. "And here," she finished by poking me over my heart. I smiled back at her, feeling an echo of things that I myself had said in the past. "Thank you for everything. We would be lost without you. Twilight, if all goes well, it will be me saying that to you. I just hope that we haven't brought you here in vain." A sense of dread pulsed within me, but I pushed it down. "Thanks again. I'm going to get some rest." I nodded in the direction that Pinkie Pie had gone after the children. "Will you make sure that Pinkie Pie gets a place to rest?" Cheerilee nodded. "Of course. Rest well, Twilight Sparkle." I left the meeting room and headed down the corridor Big Mac had taken everyone. I didn't see him, but figured out if I listened at the doors I would be able to find my friends. As I reached the second set of doors, I heard some voices coming out of the one on the right. I paused, listening to the voices, and was able to pick out Rainbow Dash's confident voice intermixed with Fluttershy's soft voice. As I debated whether or not to knock and see how they were doing, Rainbow's voice grew panicked and was silenced by a sudden humph. Panicking myself, I pushed the door open quickly. "Rainbow, are you?" I stopped in surprise, door and mouth hanging open. Rainbow was sitting on a bed, a shocked expression on her face, tentatively holding Fluttershy, who apparently had wrapped her arms tightly around Rainbow and was kissing her passionately. After what seemed like an eternity, Fluttershy broke the kiss, eyes hopeful, and Rainbow just stared at her, barely acknowledging my presence. Fluttershy finally noticed me first, and blushing furiously, let out a squeak of surprise and proceeded to leap into the other bed, burying herself under the blankets. Rainbow was still sitting there shocked, one hand on her lips, eyes darting back and forth between me and Fluttershy, who continued to huddle in the bed. Deciding that discretion was a better option, I slowly backed out of the room, gently closing the door behind me. I paused for a minute, but heard only the rustling of bedclothes and no more voices. Thoughts were flying through my head. Fluttershy? Truly? She was always She's always been with Rainbow as much as possible, but I thought that was just because they were Pegasi. Was there really something more to her in her admiration? Rainbow has always been there for her. Is it truly love, or just a misguided affection? I hadn't realized that I was walking and talking to myself until I heard a door open next to me, and Rarity poked her head out. "Is anything the matter, Twilight dear?" she asked. I jumped, caught off guard. "Oh, Rarity, you surprised me." I settled myself down and replied, No, nothing's wrong. Are you okay? Settled in?" She nodded, seeming unconvinced, but let the matter pass. "Yes, Applejack and I are sharing this room. Spike has one for the two of you just over there." She pointed across the way, and I followed her finger to the door she was indicating. Nodding my thanks, I moved over to it and heard her shut the door after me. Thoughts still buzzing around, I opened the door and entered the room. Spike was already on one of the beds, snoring away. I smiled at him and proceeded to slip into the other bed. Despite my overwrought brain, I managed to fall asleep almost immediately and did not wake until late in the following morning.